You can go ahead and turn in your Bibles to Exodus chapter 3. Music team can be dismissed. Like most kids growing up, I knew the story of Moses just from Sunday school. And like most kids growing up, I would wander in and out of the living room on weekends when the television was on and stop. And if the movie wasn't too old, I'd watch for a while. And sometimes there was one of those really old ones on. And I began to discover at one point that it was familiar to me because this man was holding 2 stone tablets. And I thought, that's Moses. He's much taller and whiter than I anticipated. And they all speak English, which is impressive. But he was coming down from the mountain, and so I watched for a while, and I realized this is just telling the biblical story of Moses, and I was engaged in it, and it's a long film, so I didn't last being a little kid. And at some other point, I wandered in. This was much later. It may have been years, most likely months. And the story of Moses was being told again, and I was unfamiliar with this scene because Moses was imprisoned. And he actually was yelling that he was a man. And I quickly realized that Moses had been put in prison by an entire planet of these apes. And I remember being very confused at that point. And I realized that was the first time that Hollywood let me down. And it would not be the last. But the story of Moses is one that's so familiar, it can be difficult to read into it. In fact, the Bible, unfortunately, just will throw down uninspired titles. And over Exodus 3, it's the burning bush. And you can quickly be like, oh, yeah, the burning bush, I remember that. And you move right on, and you continue through the story. But it's a fascinating point in Bible history to just stop and consider what it says. Because as we read from Acts, we're talking about the life of Moses with really 2 40-year segments. And really 40 years is a long time. And when you pick up in Exodus chapter 3, verse 1, it just says, "Now Moses was pasturing the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian. And he led the flock to the west side of the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God." 40 years is a long time. It's a long time to forget your old life. It's a long enough time to actually feel settled into a new life. And really, for Moses, when we pick up here, it had been 80 years since his mother, in defiance of Pharaoh's edict, had placed her child, cared for her child, placed him in a basket, and strategically set him out on the Nile, only to be miraculously and supernaturally rescued and taken in by the very princess of Egypt. So that first 40 years as an Egyptian prince must, at this point in Moses' life, seem like an entire different lifetime, a separate life that he had lived for the first 40 years. The training, the pomp, the blessings of royalty that he would experience. And then fresh in his mind would always be that day, the day that he sensed a calling as deliverer and reacted from emotion and acted out in an attempt at compassion, an attempt to understand who he is and what he needed to do, an attempt to stop abuse, to stop one of his own brethren from being brutally attacked by his Egyptian captor, and he killed a man. It must sit fresh in his mind. He'd taken a man's life, but he wasn't seen as the redeemer by his own people, as we read from Acts chapter 7. He was seen as a murderer and, in fact, caused him to flee. Now, there's no doubt during the first couple years of his time in Midian, on the run is how he felt, and on the run he was. And there's no doubt that he'd be constantly looking over his shoulder, wondering when they would find him, wondering if they would find him, and not knowing what his future may hold. But then marriage, a couple of sons, a new profession, and then decade after decade begins to click by. And 40 years is a long time. You stop looking over your shoulder. You stop hearing and sensing the presence of people who are never there, and you relax. You actually enjoy some peace, some happiness. And no doubt you've come to the realization that this is most likely how your life will end. Enjoying creation, taking care of flocks, having a family, living with your in-laws. It's not always perfect. And then the strangest thing. Moses had no doubt seen many burning bushes, starting fires, keeping him warm at night. In fact, the only thing that you could actually burn in these parts, you'd have probably two choices to choose from: thorn bushes and rocks. One of them would be difficult, and the other would be quickly consumed. But this one's different. It's burning, but it's not going out. If a thorn bush catches on fire, it's not going to last long. It's going to be consumed and move on. In fact, it's burning, but it doesn't even appear to be on fire. It's difficult for Moses to even perceive what might be taking place, and he has to take a closer look. Verse 2, the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a blazing fire from the midst of a bush. And he looked, and behold, the bush was burning with fire, yet the bush was not consumed. So Moses said, I must turn aside now and see this marvelous sight, why the bush is not burned up. It is something that caught his attention and something that he moved forward in to figure out. He moves to take a closer look. Now, decades earlier, he would have probably been a little suspicious. In fact, maybe this is a trap. One of those Egyptian magicians is out here. Who knows what may be happening here? He would have sensed a presence that wouldn't have been there. But now he doesn't even think about it. He just moves forward. No thought even crossed his mind. And what we're about to experience is God himself interceding, revealing himself to Moses and to Egypt and ultimately to his people in order to redeem them. And that's where we'll continue to walk. Moses turns aside. Verse 4, when the Lord saw that he turned aside to look, God called to him from the midst of the bush and said, Moses, Moses. And he said, here I am. Moses' first encounter, he turns aside not expecting, trying to figure out what was going on, definitely not expecting a voice, no doubt, coming from the bush, and one that would know who he was, and one that would use a term of endearment by using the doubling of his name to show a care for him and an intimacy that Moses didn't expect. And so, as any man would do, from a bush that speaks to him, that's on fire, not being consumed, and knows his name, he says, here I am. That's his statement. Because he understands at this point there's more going on here than he first anticipated. Then he said, the voice, God himself speaking from the bush, verse 5, do not come near here. Remove your sandals from your feet, for the place on which you are standing is holy ground. And so we get to this beautiful picture, and we get this great scene, a bush that's on fire. And then all of a sudden we discover that this is holy ground that we're on. And then you begin to wonder, if the bush is on fire, representing the very presence of God, and the ground on which Moses now enters is a holy ground, why just the bush? Why not the entire mountain appeared as if it was on fire? Why not the entire thing being consumed before him, really exposing the majesty, the glory, the power of God? Well, what we'll discover, and I won't get to it today, we'll continue with our Moses story as the other guys pick it up. But in Exodus 19:18, God would consume the mountain when he reveals himself to all of Israel. This very place, he promises to bring the people here to worship, and he does just that. In fact, in Exodus 24:17, God's very presence is represented as a consuming fire. But here we have a bush on fire yet not consumed. And Hebrews 12:29 reiterates that and tells us that our God is in fact a consuming fire. And so we have this representation of God as he reveals himself to Moses. And there is a terrifying expectation of judgment. Verse 6, he said also, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And then Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look at God. A sinful person in the presence of a holy God will immediately fear the consuming fire of God, because we know sin must be judged. A sinful person will know in the presence of a holy God, there is something amiss. I am not worthy to be here. God has declared the ground on which you stand is holy. Remove your sandals. And then he declares to be the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, resulting in a fear of Moses, a fear in Moses, a fear for his life, in response to the very presence of God, understanding the magnitude and the participation that he was not anticipating as he simply turned aside to look at a sideshow attraction that has now turned into the very revelation of God himself. And so God reveals himself to Moses. And this fire then symbolizes God's powerful and consuming, and in this situation, preserving presence. Because it's not a fire like we would anticipate. For our response to fire is immediately an understanding that it is out of control. There's no way to control it. It will simply consume until there's nothing left. But in this situation, what we have the power and the consuming power, but the preserving presence of it, a control of the fire that shows that God is in complete control, yet completely powerful to consume all in his presence, leaving Moses in a state of fear. And then verse 7, the Lord said, I have surely seen the affliction of my people who are in Egypt. I have seen, and have given heed to their cry. I've heard, because of their taskmasters, for I am aware of their suffering. I have seen, I have heard, and I know, is God's declaration to Moses. And this is in fact what we see in verse 5 when he says the place on which you are standing is holy ground. This is the first occurrence, if you read starting in Genesis 1, of the noun for holy being used in the Bible. In fact, when you consider where we are, it's a little bit interesting to consider. This is now holy ground. Was it a spot that had always been holy? Because as Moses no doubt had taken his flocks through here before, this was ground that was trampled by flocks continually, but now it's holy. Why is it holy now? Because it's holy based on the inhabiting presence of God that consumes the bush without the bush being consumed. Because it's his holiness that's on display. It's not the ground. There's nothing magical. There's nothing mystical. God is in his presence, giving everything that he touches the holiness that he is emitting forth. And it's the presence of the Lord that takes the unholy, that takes the profane, that takes plot of land, piece of dirt, and a bush, and transforms that into which is sacred, holy, and set apart. And that is a beautiful picture to see early on in the story, because God is in the business of transforming the ordinary, taking the unholy, making it holy and consecrated, and taking the unholy and profane and making it extraordinary and set apart. So, at this point, we have the revelation of God, and he begins to reveal much about who he is here. What does he reveal about himself? He's revealed so much to Moses already that Moses understands who he's talking to, is filled with fear, and is actually told who this is that he is speaking with. The first thing we discover about God, that Moses discovered, is God is in fact holy. There's none like him. He's set apart. He's the Holy One. He's a covenant maker and a covenant keeper. Notice how he defines himself. I am the God, verse 6, of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. I have seen the affliction, verse 7, of my people who are in Egypt. I've given heed to their cry, and I am aware of their sufferings. Look back to Genesis 15. He makes a promise to Abraham that we looked at. God said to Abraham, Genesis 15:13, know for certain that your descendants will be strangers in a land that is not theirs, where they will be enslaved and oppressed 400 years. But I will also judge the nation whom they will serve, and afterwards they will come out with many possessions. And as for you, you will go to your fathers in peace, and you'll be buried in a good old age. Then in the fourth generation they will return here to the land of promise, for the iniquity of the Amorite is not yet complete. God is a covenant maker and a covenant keeper. He said to Abraham, know for certain Your people will be in bondage for 400 years, and know for certain that I will honor my covenant with you, and know for certain that they will return here to this very land and will worship. All of this is being laid out for Moses to see, the covenant maker and the covenant keeper, which would be very easy to forget. You think 40 years is a long time. Imagine 400. And how quickly this people could feel forgotten. That God is not a covenant maker, and at least God is not a covenant keeper. But he is indeed, and he declares himself to be just that. Not only do we see that he's a holy and he's a covenant maker and keeper, but he's compassionate. He hears and responds to the cry of his people. So it's not just about his holiness and keeping his covenant that drives him to do this. It's not that I was thumbing through the papers and I noticed a contractual obligation and I'm here to fulfill that. I'm going to need you to do a few things, sign a few documents, and then we need to go get these people out. He's compassionate. He hears and he responds to the cries of his people. These are not contractual terms he's used. These are compassionate words of affection. I have seen the affliction of my people. I've given heed to their cry because of their taskmasters, for I am aware of their suffering. So I have come down to deliver them from the power of the Egyptians. He's not removed from the problems and the sufferings of his people. In fact, God is not removed from the problems and the sufferings of anyone in this room. That's what God declares through his word. It's what he declares. I didn't forget these people after 400 years. I have said and I have kept it. And he's keeping that for each of us. He's compassionate. He hears and responds to the cries of his people. Not only that, God is intimately involved with his creation and his people, even when they don't recognize it. After 400 years, it would be easy to write God off as he's distant and removed. He says things and then he just he disappears and he kind of comes and goes from history when he feels like it. But actually, when we read the first 2 chapters, what we see is that his hidden hand is working providentially to preserve his people and to raise up this deliverer Moses. You see his hands all over Exodus 1. You see his hands all over Exodus 2. And you see this preparation as he's fulfilling his promises secretly. And now coming on the scene, he declares them to Moses. And Moses obviously trying to take all this in. Everything has been turned on its head. His retirement plan, everything has been changed around. Not only is he intimately involved, but he calls his people to do what only he can accomplish. And that's what he does here with Moses. He calls Moses to deliver an entire nation of people from the bondage of one of the greatest powers of his day, Egypt. He calls basically a shepherd, a guy, an 80-year-old out with his sheep to deliver his people, because God is in the business of calling people to do what only he can accomplish. Now it's interesting because in Exodus 2, verse 14, Moses assumed power that had not been given to him. He took on the role of ruler and judge, as his Israeli brethren pointed out. But now he's being commissioned as God's ruler and judge to accomplish what only God can do through him. And a very interesting thing about God, God calls his people to do what only he can accomplish. Look down at verse 12. And here's the wonderful thing that we can always take with us. When God calls us to do something that only he can accomplish, certainly I will be with you. What other confidence does Moses need? What confidence do we need other than the fact that God's promised to be with us? And so that's what Moses begins to discover. That's what we begin to discover in the very revelation of God as he unfolds his plan of redemption, as he unfolds his plan of saving his people. And then one of the most beautiful verses of the passage, verse 8, I have come down to deliver them from the power of the Egyptians and to bring them up from that land to a good and spacious land, to a land flowing with milk and honey, to the place of the Canaanite and the Hittite and the Amorite and the Perizzite and the Hivite and the Jebusite. Now behold, the cry of the sons of Israel has come to me. Furthermore, I have seen the oppression with which the Egyptians are oppressing them. I have come down. There's no more dramatic statement. The Lord himself has shown up on the scene. That's his declaration to Moses. I myself have come down. The Lord never saves from a distance, but he always reveals himself to the people to whom he will redeem. In fact, God doesn't send a right hand. What we find in Scripture is that he extends his right hand. God is intimately involved in this. I have come down. The Lord never saves from a distance, but always reveals himself to redeem his people. And in order to redeem and deliver his people, he reveals himself to Moses. And in his presence, it's at his presence that we'll see here this burning bush will quickly turn into a pillar of fire that will lead them out of Egypt. It'll be the pillar of fire, God himself, that will guard them from a pursuing Egyptian army and that will bring them to this very mountain, fulfilling the promise that he's called Moses to participate in. And it's there in Exodus 19:4 that God will summarize this whole idea of being intimately involved with the salvation of his people when he says, you yourselves have seen what I did to the Egyptians. Calling Moses to deliver, God will look back in summary and say, you yourselves have seen what I did to the Egyptians and how I bore you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Because the Lord never saves from a distance. He's intimately involved in the process, and he always reveals himself to redeem his people. He's intimately involved here. He's compassionate. He calls Moses to accomplish what only he can accomplish through Moses. He's the Holy One. He's the covenant maker, and he's the covenant keeper. Verse 10. Therefore, come now. I will send you to Pharaoh so that you may bring my people, the sons of Israel, out of Egypt. But Moses said to God, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and that I should bring the sons of Israel out of Egypt? The humility that comes from time has set into the life of Moses. When God calls us to accomplish something only he can do, the natural and humble and cognitive response is to simply say, who am I? Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh? That I should bring the sons of Israel out of Egypt? Who am I to accomplish this? Moses learned his lesson 40 years ago when he didn't bother to stop to say, who am I to redeem this people, to take this into my own hands and to kill this man and to begin an uprising. He reacted to injustice, but he didn't do it in God's timing. And so now his first response to this charge is, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and that I should bring the sons of Israel out of Egypt? And then God responds without responding. And he said, certainly I will be with you. And this shall be the sign to you that it is I who have sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you shall worship God at this mountain. And that would excite me. It would no doubt excite Moses. Who am I that I would do this? Exactly. Don't worry about it. I will be with you. Oh, okay. I can accomplish this. I'll do this. And this shall be a sign for you that it is I who have sent you. And then there's almost an excitement. Not only is God going to be with me, but he'll give me a sign. And what's the sign? When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you shall worship God at this mountain. You're like, good, that's the sign. Wait. You're given the sign after I accomplish what you're asking me to do. I prefer the sign before I go to make sure this is all good. But for God, he calls Moses to accomplish what only he can accomplish. And it's enough. The sign will be given as a future tense, a promise of help and a sign of fulfillment. Because God requires faith. He requires the faith of Moses, and in this process, he encourages faith. Because following God begins with faith. Faith that he can do it, not only that he can do it, but faith that he will do it. And verse 12 is the call to Moses to have faith in the God who's called him. Moses' faith will not come to fulfillment for 3 months. So it's a 3-month process. Later at that very mountain, an entire nation will be brought from exile to serve and worship the one true God, Yahweh. And God's promises are often given in such a way that only he can fulfill them. And that's the very revelation that Moses receives here as he begins to take up this challenge. So not only does he declare, "Who am I?" but verse 13, he now asks the logical question, well, then who are you? Then Moses said to God, "Behold, I'm going to the sons of Israel. I will say to them, the God of your fathers has sent me to you. Now they may say to me, what is his name? What shall I say to them?" So in this case, Moses, I accept the charge. He doesn't back down from it. I will go, I will say this, and then he's asking for some apologetic help here. Well, just say, for instance, say they say this, what do I say to them? And so he asks God this very clear question. If they ask me, what is his name, what shall I say to them? Notice he doesn't say, well, what is your name? He said, if they ask what your name is, what shall I say to them? So Moses, not only does he say, who am I, but now he asks God, well, who are you? Because Moses knew the power of the Egyptian army. He was trained there. He understood the power of the Egyptian army. He also understood the helpless condition of Israel in bondage, as far as they're not amassing a lot of military might when they're being beaten and forced slavery throughout the days. He understands the power of Egypt. He understands the bondage of Israel. But at this point, he doesn't quite know the power of God and what it is that he's about to experience. Now, for Moses to ask this question, if they ask, what is his name, what shall I say to them? No one is immune from the impact of their culture and their society. And that's what Moses is bringing in a little bit. In fact, Stuart Douglas, in his commentary on Exodus, describes this time and era as a polytheistic, pantheistic, and syncretistic world in which all people groups and nations, there are no known exceptions, believe that there were many gods, that all nature partook to some degree of divinity, and that all religions had at least some validity, no matter how many or what sort of gods or goddesses those religions worshipped. And so as Moses looks to bring this charge and know that God himself, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, is with him and will certainly be with him, and he will receive this sign, and he is determined to go and to declare this, the God of your fathers has sent me. He would like a name. He would like to declare this is who it is. Maybe due to the concept of polytheism, Israel may have really wondered which God Moses would come representing. How can I distinguish you from all these false gods, which he had learned much about in his time in Egypt. But there's a second thing in the Hebrew. The name implies character, because for the Hebrew, a name either signified the character of the person or brought to mind something very distinctive about that individual. And so there was much in a name. So to ask for the name of God was a desire to know the very nature of God. It wasn't simply some name so you can make sure that you understand who it is, but who do you explain yourself as? So what God had promised to do for Israel was based not on what he would do for Israel, but who he would be for Israel. And that was their understanding. God answers Moses' question to know more about the nature of God in 13 through 15. So Moses said to God, I am going. What if they ask me your name? What shall I say? God said to Moses, I am who I am. And he said, thus you shall say to the sons of Israel, I am has sent me to you. And God furthermore said to Moses, thus you shall say to the sons of Israel, the Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob, has sent me to you. This is my name forever, and this is my memorial name to all generations. Yahweh, God's proper name in the Hebrew. And the importance of the I am who I am declaration, that Yahweh is God's name, is seen in its sheer occurrence in Scripture 6,828 times in the Old Testament alone. And that's 3 times as many times as the generic term El for God, which goes to show that God is in fact wanting to distinguish himself not as some generic deity, not as simply a God among many gods, but the God with the unique character and the unique mission that begins to reveal himself to Moses by giving Moses his name. Yahweh, I am who I am, the creator, the sustainer of all that exists, and therefore the Lord of all creation and all of history. All that is and all that is happening, all that will happen. A God active and present in all the affairs of life. Literally, you can translate it a couple ways. It's causal, so you could say, I caused to be because I caused to be. I am who I am is a good way to think about it, because it's God's ultimate self-revelation of himself. So as God continues to reveal himself, we get more information on who God is, because there is much to a name, and God gives us much here to think on. Because if it's God's ultimate self-revelation of himself, it must tell us much about who God is, what God is like, the very nature and mission of God. And it does indeed do that, because he reveals himself as the eternal, unchangeable one who exists independently from all other things. The first thing I am who I am declares is that he exists. He is there. There's nothing behind him. There's nothing before him. I am. It's a declaration of being. It's a declaration of existence. This is a God who exists. It is not a God who was created. He simply is, and he causes himself to be. He's independent. He has no creator and is dependent on no one. No one can claim God as a dependent. That was my attempt at an April 15th joke. No one can claim God as a dependent. And under number of dependents, God would put all, billions, because everything and everyone is dependent to him. He is alone is the independent one. He therefore exists. He is independent. I am who I am declares him to be the eternal one. God has always existed. He has no beginning. He has no end. And he's the unchangeable one. In Malachi 3:6, God says, I, Yahweh, do not change. Therefore you, O sons of Jacob, are not consumed. God is not influenced and he is not coerced by outside forces. He alone is the force to be reckoned with. He is the same yesterday, today, and forever. He is the unchangeable one. And he declares in Isaiah 43, verse 1, but now, thus says the Lord, your creator, O Jacob, and he who formed you, O Israel, do not fear, for I have redeemed you. I have called you by name. You are mine. When you pass through the waters, I will be with you. And through the rivers, they will not overflow you. And when you walk through the fire, you will not be scorched, nor will the flame burn you. For I am the Lord your God, the Holy One of Israel, your Savior. I have given Egypt as your ransom, Cush and Seba in your place. Yahweh, the eternal, unchangeable one who exists independently from all other creation. He alone creates. He alone is the creator. So he reveals himself in all of this, and you're like, boy, that's a lot just in one name, I am who I am. But Moses was very clear and understood exactly what God was saying. It wouldn't have seemed foolish to say, I am has sent me to you, because he is the God above all other gods. Verse 15. God furthermore said to Moses, thus you shall say to the sons of Israel, the Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob has sent me to you. This is my name forever, eternal. This is my memorial name to all generations. Go and gather the elders of Israel together and say to them, the Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, has appeared to me, saying, I am indeed concerned about you and what has been done to you in Egypt. So I said, I will bring you up out of the affliction of Egypt to the land of the Canaanite and the Hittite and the Amorite and the Perizzite and the Hivite and the Jebusite, to a land flowing with milk and honey. They will pay heed to what you say. And you, with the elders of Israel, will come to the king of Egypt, and you will say to him, the Lord, The God of the Hebrews has met with us. So now please let us go 3 days' journey into the wilderness, that we may sacrifice to the Lord our God. But I know that the king of Egypt will not permit you to go, except under compulsion. So I will stretch out my hand and strike Egypt with all my miracles which I shall do in the midst of it. And after that, he will let you go. And I will grant this people favor in the sight of the Egyptians. And it shall be that when you go, you will not go empty-handed, but every woman shall ask of her neighbor, and the woman who lives in her house, articles of silver and articles of gold and clothing, and you will put them on your sons and daughters, and thus you will plunder the Egyptians. God reveals not only himself, but his roadmap for redemption to Moses as he lays it out for him. Moses is called to be his ambassador. He's called to be his spokesman, his prophetic voice, the very voice of God to his people. And that begins the call of Moses. We'll stop there for tonight. But it's interesting because our journey started in Genesis chapter 3 and has led us here. It's a journey looking for the one who would make all things right, who would crush the serpent under his heel. We looked at Noah. We looked at Abraham, we looked at Jacob, we looked at Joseph, and tonight we've looked at Moses. And none of them were able to conquer sin and death. Men of God used by God, but ultimately no deliverance for our greatest foe, sin and death. In fact, Moses, what we'll discover, is his ministry is one of sin and death. A sinful people called to wander in the wilderness for 40 years in order for them to die out because of their sin. Sin and death within the midst of his very ministry. And he would actually see death and would not see the land because of his own sin. And he would not enter the promised land. But it's interesting because Moses knew he wasn't the final conqueror, only a temporary deliverer on a road that would lead ultimately to the cross. In Deuteronomy 18, Moses declares this: "The Lord your God will raise up for you a prophet like me from among you, from your countrymen. You shall listen to him. This is according to all that you asked of the Lord your God in Horeb on the day of the assembly, saying, 'Let me not hear again the voice of the Lord my God. Let me not see this great fire anymore, or I will die.' And the Lord said to me, 'They have spoken well. I will raise up a prophet from among their countrymen like you, and I will put my words in his mouth, and he shall speak to them all that I command him. And it shall come about that whoever will not listen to my words which he shall speak in my name, I myself will require it of him.'" In fact, Jesus himself would confirm this very thing in John chapter 8. He's questioned. So the Jews said to him, "You are not yet 50 years old, and you have seen Abraham?" Jesus said to them, "Truly, truly, I say to you, before Abraham was born, I am." Therefore they picked up stones to throw at him. But Jesus hid himself and went out of the temple. Jesus gives us his name, Yahweh, I am. He declares that the Jews who heard it knew exactly what he was saying and knew exactly who he was claiming to be. An unmistakable declaration by the Son of God who came to take away the sins of the world. Yahweh on the scene. Before Abraham was born, I am. And when Moses was asked, "By whose authority were you sent?" the best he could say and what he was told to say was, "I am sent me." When Jesus' authority was questioned, he said, "I am." There was no sent me. He declared to be God in the flesh, the very one who came to redeem mankind, Yahweh in the flesh. It's Jesus who declares himself to be the eternal, unchangeable one who exists independently. It's Jesus himself who puts his whole life and ministry on display. Because if there's one thing we learn from Exodus 3 that will echo all the way forward into the New Testament, it's that the Lord never saves from a distance, but he always reveals himself to redeem his people. And there's no greater revelation of God for the redemption of mankind than we see in Jesus Christ. He's the great deliverer. He is the exact representation of God, and he's God in the flesh. And we'll close with this passage from Colossians. He rescued us from the domain of darkness and transferred us to the kingdom of his beloved Son, in whom we have redemption, the forgiveness of sins. He is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. For by him all things were created, both in the heavens and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities. All things have been created through him and for him. He's before all things, and in him all things hold together. He is also head of the body, the church. He's the beginning of the firstborn from the dead, so that he himself will come to have first place in everything. For it was the Father's good pleasure for all the fullness to dwell in him, and through him to reconcile all things to himself, having made peace through the blood of his cross. Through him I say, whether things on earth or things in heaven.